July 2009. A detective's phone rings at 3:12 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon in Harlan County, Kentucky. The caller ID shows the state crime lab. The voice on the other end is careful, measured, but there's something underneath it. Excitement, disbelief, maybe both. "We got a hit." 3 words. That's all it takes to crack open a case that's been gathering dust for 31 years. Detective Sarah Chen sits back in her chair, and for a moment the sounds of the office fade. Keyboards clicking, phones ringing, someone laughing down the hall. None of it registers. Because right now, in her hand, she's holding something impossible. A name. A suspect in a case everyone thought would never be solved. Rebecca Sullivan had been waiting since 1978. Chen closes her eyes for just a second. She's only been on the cold case unit for 2 years, but she knows what this means. Knows what it means for the family who spent 3 decades without answers. Knows what it means for a community that's carried this weight for an entire generation. And she knows what it means for Rebecca, a young woman whose voice was silenced on a summer night when disco was king and the future felt infinite. The phone feels heavy in her hand. Not because of its weight, but because of what comes next. The call she has to make. The words she has to say. The door she's about to open after 31 years of it being locked shut. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from right now. Let's rewind. Summer of 1978. Jimmy Carter's in the White House, dealing with gas lines that stretch around city blocks and an economy that's making people nervous. Saturday Night Fever came out the year before, and disco is everywhere. You can't turn on a radio without hearing the Bee Gees, Donna Summer, or that song that'll be playing in grocery stores for the next 50 years. Stayin' Alive is all over the airwaves. Ironic, considering what's about to happen. Harlan County sits deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. It's coal country. The kind of place where generations of families have pulled black rock out of the earth, where men go underground before sunrise and come back up covered in dust. The landscape is dramatic in a way that takes your breath away if you're not used to it. Mountains rise up steep and sudden, covered in dense forests that turn the hollers dark even in the middle of the day. Winding roads snake through the terrain, 2 lanes of asphalt that twist and climb and drop without warning. It's beautiful, rugged, and isolated in a way that city people don't really understand. The county is dotted with small communities, places with names like Evarts, Cumberland, Loyal, towns where the post office and the general store might be the same building, where Friday night football games bring out half the population, where if your car breaks down on a back road, someone will stop to help, because that's just what you do. In 1978, Harlan County was tight-knit in the way rural communities often are. Everyone knew everyone, or at least knew someone who knew them. Families had lived there for generations. Your grandfather worked in the same mine as your neighbor's grandfather. Your mother went to school with your friend's mother. The connections ran deep, woven through decades of shared history, shared struggle, shared pride. Life moved at a different pace there. Not slower exactly, but steadier, predictable. You could walk down a dirt road at dusk and feel safe. You could leave your keys in the ignition while you ran into the store. Crime wasn't non-existent. Nowhere is. But it was rare enough that when something did happen, it rattled people down to their bones. Summers in eastern Kentucky are hot and humid, the kind of heat that sits on you like a heavy blanket, making the air feel thick enough to cut. Nights don't cool off much. Crickets and cicadas create a wall of sound that becomes background noise. Lightning bugs drift through the darkness. People sit on porches with sweet tea, talking until the mosquitoes drive them inside. It's the kind of place where traditions matter, where Sunday meant church, where family dinners weren't optional, where neighbors looked out for each other because that's what neighbors did. There was a rhythm to life there, a predictability that felt comforting. But predictability is a funny thing. It makes you forget that danger doesn't always announce itself. It makes you trust too easily. It makes you believe that bad things happen in other places, to other people, that your community is different, special, protected by mountains and tradition, and the simple fact that everyone knows everyone. Harlan County in the summer of 1978 was peaceful, the kind of peaceful that feels permanent, like it's always been that way and always will be, until it wasn't. Because on a warm June night, while disco played on radios and families gathered on porches and the cicadas sang their endless song, something happened that would shatter that peace. Something that would haunt the community for 31 years. Something that would turn a name into a ghost, a file into an obsession, and a family into advocates who refused to let silence win. Rebecca Sullivan was 22 years old that summer. She wasn't running from anything. She wasn't caught up in anything dangerous. She was just living, working, studying, planning a future that felt endless. But time ran out for her on a night that should have been ordinary. Rebecca Sullivan wasn't the kind of person who blended into the background. At 22, she had that energy. Some people carry the kind that makes a room feel lighter when they walk in. Not louder, not demanding attention, but present in a way that mattered. She had opinions. She laughed easily. And when she cared about something, you knew it. She didn't hide behind politeness or stay quiet to keep the peace. If something needed saying, Rebecca said it. She'd been that way since she was a kid, the middle child in a family of 3. Her older brother Michael was the steady one, already married at 25 and working at the same mine where their father had spent the last 30 years. Her younger sister Jennifer was still figuring things out at 19, caught between wanting to leave Harlan County and being too scared to actually go. Rebecca was somewhere in the middle. Ambitious, but rooted. She wanted more, but she wasn't running away to get it. She was studying to be a teacher. Not because it was expected, not because it was safe, but because she'd grown up watching her own teachers shape kids' lives in this community, and she wanted to do the same. She'd seen how much it mattered when a teacher believed in you, especially in a place like Harlan County where opportunities didn't exactly fall into your lap, where getting out meant either coal mining or leaving entirely. Rebecca wanted to stay. She wanted to teach elementary school, maybe 2nd or 3rd grade, the age where kids still got excited about learning, where you could make a difference before the world told them what they couldn't do. Her mother, Patricia, liked to tell people that Rebecca had been teaching since she was 10, teaching Jennifer how to read before kindergarten, tutoring neighbors' kids for free, setting up a pretend classroom in the living room with stuffed animals as students. It wasn't just a career choice. It was who she was. There's a photo of Rebecca from that spring, a few months before everything changed. She's sitting on the front porch of the family's house, books spread out around her, studying for finals. The sun's hitting her face at that angle that makes everything look golden. Her dark hair is pulled back in a ponytail. She's wearing jeans and a t-shirt from a Lynyrd Skynyrd concert she'd gone to the year before. And she's smiling. Not posing for the camera, just genuinely happy. Caught in a moment that felt ordinary at the time but would become precious later. That's the Rebecca her family wants people to remember. Not the headlines. Not the crime scene. Not the case file that would sit in a drawer for 31 years. Just her. The person she was before someone decided she didn't deserve to be anymore. Because here's the truth. Rebecca Sullivan was more than what happened to her. She was a part-time waitress at Rosie's Diner on Highway 421. The kind of roadside place with vinyl booths, a jukebox that still worked, and coffee that could wake the dead. She'd been working there since her sophomore year of college, picking up evening and weekend shifts to help pay for school. Southeast Kentucky Community College wasn't expensive by university standards, but money was tight for most families in the area, including the Sullivans. Rebecca was good at waitressing, the kind of good that comes from actually caring about people, not just going through the motions. She remembered the regulars' orders. She checked on the elderly couples who came in every Sunday after church. She made conversation with the truckers passing through, people who just needed someone to talk to for 20 minutes while they ate their eggs and grits. The owner, Rose Caldwell, treated her like family. The cook, an older man named Earl who'd worked there since the place opened, would slip her extra fries and tell her she was too skinny. Her co-workers were mostly other young women from the area, trying to make rent or save for something better. They swapped shifts when someone needed a day off. They covered for each other when life got messy. It was steady work, honest work, and Rebecca never looked down on it, even though she knew it wasn't forever. At home, she was the glue that held things together in ways that only middle children seem to manage. She mediated when Michael and their father butted heads about politics or the future of coal mining. She listened when Jennifer complained about feeling stuck. She helped her mother with dinner, with errands, with the 1,000 small things that keep a household running. The Sullivans were close. Not perfect, no family is, but close in the way that matters. Sunday dinners were non-negotiable. Holidays meant the whole family together, and when something happened to one of them, it happened to all of them. Rebecca had friends too, girls she'd grown up with, people who knew her well enough to finish her sentences. They'd meet up on Friday nights, drive around with the windows down and the radio up. Sometimes they'd end up at someone's house talking until 2 a.m. about everything and nothing. Boys they liked, dreams they had, complaints about work or school or parents who didn't understand. She'd dated a couple guys over the years, nothing serious, nothing that stuck. She wasn't in a rush. At 22, she figured she had time. On weekends when she wasn't working, she'd take drives through the mountains in her pale blue 1972 Chevy Nova. It wasn't much to look at, some rust on the wheel wells, a dent in the back bumper from where she'd backed into a fence post the previous winter, but it was hers. She'd saved up for 6 months to buy it. And on those drives, windows down, music playing, she felt free in a way that's hard to explain to people who've never lived in a place where the mountains close in on you. Rebecca wasn't reckless. She didn't take stupid risks or put herself in dangerous situations. She was cautious in the ways that mattered. She locked her car doors at night. She didn't hitchhike. She told people where she was going. But she also wasn't afraid to live. She'd go out. She'd meet new people. She trusted her instincts. And for the most part, those instincts served her well. She knew how to read a room. She knew when to leave a situation that felt off. She'd grown up in Harlan County, which meant she understood the unspoken rules of a place where everyone's connected by about 2 degrees of separation. Being 22 in 1978 in rural Kentucky meant something specific. It meant balancing independence with the expectations of a community that watched you grow up. It meant wanting more than what your parents had, but not wanting to abandon the place that made you who you were. It meant navigating a world that was changing. Women's liberation, shifting social norms, new possibilities, while living in a place where some things stayed the same for generations. Rebecca was building a future. Not a flashy one, but hers. She'd finish her associate's degree next spring. Apply for her teaching certification. Maybe get a job at one of the elementary schools in the county. Find a small place of her own, something she could afford on a teacher's salary. Eventually, maybe she'd meet someone worth settling down with. Maybe they'd have kids. Maybe those kids would sit in her classroom someday and she'd get to teach another generation of Harlan County children. The future stretched out in front of her. Not infinite, but expansive enough. Full of maybes and possibilities and plans that felt solid even though they were still forming. She trusted her community. Trusted that the place that had raised her would continue to be safe. That the mountains that surrounded her were protection, not prison. That the connections between people here meant something. That you could walk down a dark road at night and nothing bad would happen because bad things didn't happen to people like her. Until they did. In the days leading up to June 14th, Rebecca was just Rebecca. She complained about a difficult customer at the diner. She studied for an upcoming exam. She made plans to go to the movies with her sister Jennifer that weekend. She didn't know she was running out of time. None of us ever do. June 14th, 1978. Wednesday. Rebecca woke up to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. The house was already warm, that humid Kentucky heat that settles in by mid-June. She could hear her mother in the kitchen. Coffee brewing. Radio playing softly. It was a normal morning. So normal that no one would remember the details later. What Rebecca ate for breakfast, what she wore, whether she seemed worried about anything. Normal doesn't stick in your memory. It's only later, when you're desperately trying to reconstruct someone's last hours, that you realize how much you've forgotten. She had classes that morning at Southeast Kentucky Community College. 2 of them. She drove the 20 minutes to campus in her Nova, windows down because the air conditioning didn't work. After classes, she came home, spent the afternoon studying, helping her mother with chores. Around 5:30 p.m., Rebecca started getting ready for her evening shift at Rosie's diner. Black pants, white shirt, the small apron Rose insisted all the waitresses wear. "You working late tonight?" Patricia asked from the stove. "Till close," Rebecca said, grabbing her keys. "Should be home by 10:30, maybe 11. Drive safe." "Always do." Those were the last words Patricia Sullivan said to her daughter. Not profound, not meaningful, just the same thing she'd said 100 times before. The kind of throwaway exchange that becomes unbearable later. Rebecca left around 5:45 p.m. The evening shift at Rosie's started at 6 p.m. The diner sat right off Highway 421, the kind of place that served breakfast all day and dinner until 10 p.m. That Wednesday evening was warm, bordering on hot. The sun hung low, turning everything golden. The air smelled like honeysuckle and diesel fuel from passing trucks. Rebecca's shift was busy but not overwhelming. The usual crowd, families getting dinner, couples on dates, truckers stopping for coffee and pie. A few regulars at the counter reading the newspaper. Earl, the cook, worked the grill. Rose moved between the register and kitchen. The other waitress was Linda, someone Rebecca had known since high school. They swapped sections when one got slammed, shared tips, complained about sore feet. Normal, all of it. Just another Wednesday night. The shift wound down around 9:30. Rebecca and Linda wiped down tables, refilled salt shakers, counted their tips. Rose tallied the register. Earl cleaned the grill. Around 9:45 p.m., Rebecca clocked out. She said goodnight to Rose, to Linda. Earl was out back taking out trash. Rebecca pushed through the back door, called out to him. "See you Friday, Earl. Drive safe, Becky." He watched her walk across the gravel parking lot toward her pale blue Nova, here parked under one of the overhead lights. She got to her car, opened the door, tossed her purse onto the passenger seat. She turned back, gave him a wave. That was the last confirmed sighting of Rebecca Sullivan alive. What happened between 9:45 p.m. and sunrise on June 15th is a gap investigators would spend years trying to fill. At the Sullivan house, Patricia went to bed around 11 p.m., assuming Rebecca had gotten held up or stopped somewhere. It happens sometimes. Nothing to worry about. But when she woke Thursday morning and Rebecca's bed was still made, untouched, the worry started. She called the diner. No, Rebecca had left right after her shift ended, same as always. Patricia called Rebecca's friends. Had anyone seen her? Nothing. By mid-morning, the worry had turned to panic. Robert called the sheriff's office, filed a missing person report. Rebecca Sullivan, 22 years old, last seen leaving Rosie's diner around 9:45 p.m., driving a pale blue 1972 Chevy Nova. While the family was making calls, 2 hikers were making their way through a wooded area near Cumberland Gap. Cumberland Gap sits where Kentucky meets Virginia and Tennessee. The area is a mix of state forest and unmarked trails, the kind of place where you can walk for miles without seeing another person. Around 7:30 a.m., one of the hikers saw something that didn't belong. The trees were dense there, oak and pine so thick the ground stayed in shadow. The underbrush was heavy, and there, partially concealed but not hidden, was Rebecca. The hiker's brain didn't process it immediately. You don't expect to find a body on a morning walk. But then reality caught up. They ran. Found their way back to the trailhead, found a ranger station, called 911 with shaking hands. Within an hour, the area was swarming with law enforcement. Harlan County Sheriff's Department, state police, crime scene investigators. Yellow tape went up, cordoning off a section of forest that would be photographed, measured, documented. Rebecca's body lay near the base of a tree. Her clothing was disturbed. There were signs of a struggle. The scene was devastating. Rebecca had been attacked with violence that suggested rage. This wasn't quick. This was personal, furious. The medical examiner would later determine the cause of death, but even before the autopsy, it was clear. Murder, intentional, brutal. The woods around the scene were quiet, eerily so, just the low murmur of investigators working in hushed tones, photographs, measurements, evidence collection. Every detail cataloged because in 1978, you didn't get a second chance at a crime scene. If you're still with me, drop a comment. What time is it where you are? I'm curious how many of you are watching this late at night. Word spread through Harlan County the way it always does in small communities. Not through official channels first, through phone calls, whispered conversations. Someone's cousin worked dispatch. Someone else's neighbor was one of the hikers. By evening, half the county knew. Rebecca Sullivan, 22 years old, found dead. The reaction was visceral. This was the kind of crime that shattered the illusion of safety. Because if it could happen to Rebecca, a local girl, someone people knew, someone who wasn't involved in anything dangerous, then it could happen to anyone. Parents started locking doors. Women stopped going out alone after dark. Conversations shifted to fear and speculation. Who did this? Why? Are they still out there? The Sullivan family was in freefall. Grief doesn't hit all at once. It comes in waves, the shock, the denial, the crushing reality that Rebecca wasn't coming home. Ever. Patricia couldn't stop crying. Robert couldn't cry at all. Michael took charge of logistics, calling relatives, making arrangements, fielding questions from investigators. Jennifer shut down completely. Friends showed up with casseroles and condolences. But what do you say? I'm sorry feels inadequate when someone's daughter has been murdered. The funeral was 3 days later, standing room only. Rebecca's casket sat at the front of the church, closed. The family wanted people to remember her the way she was, smiling, alive. The service was a blur of tears and hymns and a eulogy that tried to capture 22 years in a few minutes. But how do you summarize a life cut short? How do you explain the weight of a future that will never happen? And while the family grieved, investigators got to work. Because somewhere out there, the person who killed Rebecca Sullivan was walking around free. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they thought they'd gotten away with it. They had no idea that 31 years later, science would come knocking. The investigation into Rebecca Sullivan's murder launched with the kind of urgency you'd expect. This wasn't some low-priority case that got shuffled to the bottom of the pile. This was a young woman violently killed in a community that wasn't used to this level of violence. The pressure was on from the family, from the public, from the department itself. Detective Frank Morrison was assigned as lead. He was 45, a veteran with the Harlan County Sheriff's Department who'd worked homicides before. Not many, because Harlan County didn't see many murders, but enough to know what he was doing. Enough to understand that the first 48 hours were critical. After that, leads go cold. Witnesses forget details. Evidence degrades. The window of opportunity starts closing, and once it shuts, it's almost impossible to pry back open. So they moved quickly. The crime scene had already been processed on June 15th. The wooded area near Cumberland Gap had been photographed from every angle. Measurements taken, the body's position documented. Now came the harder part, making sense of what they'd found. Physical evidence was collected and cataloged. Rebecca's clothing. Soil samples from the area. Fibers that didn't seem to belong. Biological material that would later be tested, though in 1978, tested meant something very different than it does today. DNA analysis didn't exist yet. Not in any practical, usable form. The first use of DNA in a criminal case wouldn't happen until 1986 in the UK, and it would be years before it became standard practice in the United States. So, while investigators collected samples that might contain the killer's DNA, they had no way to analyze it in any meaningful way. What they did have were fingerprints, blood typing, and hair analysis, though that was notoriously unreliable. They had witness interviews, timelines, theories, and they had questions. So many questions. Who was Rebecca with that night? Did she know her killer? Was this random or targeted? Was the killer local or just passing through? Every question led to 3 more. Detective Morrison started with Rebecca's inner circle. That's standard procedure in any homicide. You work from the inside out. family, friends, co-workers, anyone who had regular contact with the victim. Not because you assume they're guilty, but because statistically, most people are killed by someone they know. Rebecca's family was cooperative. Devastated, but cooperative. They answered every question, no matter how painful. They provided names, timelines, details about Rebecca's routines, her relationships, her state of mind in the days leading up to her death. Nothing raised red flags. Her friends were interviewed next. One by one, they sat across from detectives and recounted the last time they'd seen Rebecca, what she'd said, how she'd seemed, whether she'd mentioned anything unusual, a strange encounter, someone following her, a gut feeling that something was off. Again, nothing. Co-workers at Rosie's diner were questioned. Had anyone at her job been inappropriate with her? Had there been conflicts, tension, someone who paid a little too much attention? Rose, Earl, Linda, the other regulars, everyone was asked, everyone cooperated, still nothing. Morrison expanded the investigation. Regular customers at the diner were looked at. Anyone who might have interacted with Rebecca during her shifts. College classmates were interviewed. Professors were asked if they'd noticed anything unusual about Rebecca's behavior in the days before she died. Nobody raised red flags. It was frustrating, but not uncommon. Sometimes the victim's life is just normal. No drama, no obvious suspects, but no convenient villain waiting in the wings, which meant the killer was either someone on the periphery of Rebecca's life, an acquaintance, a passing interaction, or a complete stranger. And if it was a stranger, that made the case exponentially harder. Detectives expanded their search. They canvassed the area where Rebecca's body was found, knocking on doors within a several-mile radius. Did anyone see or hear anything unusual that night? A car that didn't belong? Voices in the woods? Anything out of the ordinary? A few people reported hearing something. Maybe a scream, maybe not. Sound travels strangely in the mountains, especially at night. What sounds like a woman screaming could be a fox, or it could be exactly what it sounds like, but no one could say for sure, and no one could pinpoint a time. Other tips came in through the phone lines. Anonymous callers. People who had a feeling about a neighbor. Rumors about someone who'd been acting strange. Most of it led nowhere. Dead ends dressed up as leads. But investigators followed every single one, because you never know which thread is going to unravel the whole case. They looked into known offenders in the area. Anyone with a history of violence, especially violence against women. Sex offenders. Parolees. People who'd recently been released from prison. They cross-referenced names, checked alibis, brought people in for questioning. Some couldn't account for their whereabouts that night, but I don't remember isn't the same as I did it. And without physical evidence tying someone to the scene, suspicion wasn't enough. The frustration was building. Every lead that looked promising turned into another dead end. Every witness who seemed credible had nothing useful to offer. The investigation was thorough, methodical, by the book, but it wasn't producing results. The forensic side of the investigation was equally challenging. The biological evidence collected from Rebecca's body and clothing was sent to the state lab for analysis. Blood typing was performed, a process that could narrow down a suspect pool, but couldn't definitively identify someone. If the killer's blood type matched 30% of the population, that still left tens of thousands of potential suspects in Kentucky alone. Hair samples were examined under a microscope. An analyst could say whether a hair was consistent with the suspect's hair, but again, not definitive. Hair analysis has since been debunked as unreliable, but in 1978, it was considered legitimate forensic science. Fingerprints were lifted from Rebecca's belongings. None matched anyone in the system, which meant either the killer had never been arrested before, or they'd been careful enough not to leave prints. Investigators also looked at the location itself. Why that spot near Cumberland Gap? Was it chosen deliberately, or was it opportunistic? The area was isolated but accessible. Someone familiar with Harlan County would know about it, but it wasn't so hidden that only a local could find it. That detail cut both ways. It didn't rule anyone in or out. Weeks turned into months. The initial flood of tips slowed to a trickle. The media coverage, which had been intense at first, started to fade. Other stories took over the headlines. A coal mine accident in another county, political scandals, national news. Life moved on for everyone except Rebecca's family. Detective Morrison kept working the case, but the reality was setting in. They were running out of leads. Every avenue had been explored. Every suspect cleared or deprioritized. The evidence they had wasn't enough to build a case, and without new information there was nowhere left to go. It's a terrible position to be in as an investigator. You know someone did this. You know they're out there living their life while Rebecca's family is trapped in grief. But knowing isn't enough. You need proof. You need evidence that will hold up in court. And they didn't have it. By September 1978, Rebecca Sullivan's case was effectively cold. Not officially. No one wanted to admit that. The files stayed open. The evidence stayed in storage. If new information came in, they'd follow up. But the active investigation had stalled. The family was told as gently as possible that unless something changed, a new witness, a confession, a breakthrough in forensic technology, there wasn't much more the department could do. It was a gut punch. Because what do you do with that? How do you move forward knowing that the person who killed your daughter, your sister, your friend, is still out there? That they might never face consequences? That justice might never come? You don't move forward. Not really. You just exist in a state of suspended grief, waiting for a phone call that might never come. Rebecca's case joined the ranks of thousands of other unsolved homicides across the country. A file in a drawer, a name in a database. A family left with questions that had no answers. For 31 years, that's where it stayed. But here's the thing about cold cases. They're only unsolved until they're not. And sometimes the breakthrough comes from a place no one in 1978 could have imagined. 1979 came and went. So did 1980, then 1981, 1982, 1983. The calendar pages kept turning. But for the Sullivan family, time moved differently. It didn't heal, it didn't soften the edges. It just stretched the grief out longer, thinner, until it became a permanent part of their lives. Patricia would wake up some mornings and for just a split second forget. Her brain would trick her into thinking everything was normal, that Rebecca was still alive. And then reality would come crashing back, and the loss would feel fresh all over again. 5 years later, 10 years later, the wound never closed. Robert threw himself into work. Easier than sitting still. Easier than thinking. He'd go down into the mine before sunrise and come back up after dark, exhausted enough that maybe he could sleep without dreaming. But every now and then, something would trigger a memory, a song on the radio, a stranger's laugh that sounded like hers, and he'd have to pull over and wait for the wave to pass. Holidays were the worst. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Rebecca's birthday, August 3rd, each one a reminder of the empty chair, the phone call that would never come, the grandchildren she'd never have. People stopped asking how they were doing after a while. Not because they didn't care, but because grief that doesn't resolve makes people uncomfortable. So the questions stopped, and the Sullivan family learned to carry their pain quietly. But they never stopped hoping for answers. Detective Morrison pulled Rebecca's file periodically. Every 6 months, maybe every year, he'd go through everything again, looking for something he'd missed. Every few years, a new detective would review it with fresh eyes. They'd check if any new techniques had become available, and every time they'd hit the same wall. In 1986, news came out of England. A man named Colin Pitchfork had been convicted of murder using DNA fingerprinting. The first criminal case ever solved using DNA analysis. The technology was experimental, expensive, not widely available, but it worked. Morrison read about it in a law enforcement journal. He sat there thinking about Rebecca's case, about the biological evidence in storage, about the possibility that someday this technology could give them the break they needed. But not yet. Not in 1986. Not in 1987 or 1988. The technology was evolving, but it wasn't helping Rebecca's case yet. The 1990s brought new hope. DNA technology was advancing rapidly. What had been experimental in 1986 was becoming standard practice by the mid-90s. Cases that had gone cold were suddenly being reopened. In 1995, Rebecca's case was reviewed again. The biological evidence was still viable, preserved well enough that it could potentially be tested. The samples had been stored properly, kept in controlled conditions. But the problem, DNA testing only works if you have something to compare it to. You need a suspect, or a database hit, or some kind of lead. They had none of that. In 1998, CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, was established as a national database. It allowed law enforcement to upload DNA profiles from crime scenes and compare them against profiles from convicted offenders. Kentucky joined CODIS that same year. Rebecca's case was entered into the database, and they waited. No hits, no matches, which meant either the killer had never been arrested or their DNA had never been collected and uploaded. Another dead end. But at least the case was in the system now. If the killer ever did get arrested, the match would trigger automatically. The Sullivan family was aging. Patricia and Robert, who'd been in their late 40s when Rebecca died, were now approaching 70. Their hair had gone gray. They moved slower, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. Michael had a family of his own now. 2 kids who'd never met their Aunt Becky, who only knew her through stories and photographs. Jennifer had gotten married, took her husband's last name, Sullivan Parker now. She had children, too. At family gatherings, someone would always bring Rebecca up. A memory, a joke she used to tell. They kept her alive through remembering. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me what's the weather like where you are. I'm always curious where you're tuning in from, and if you're getting value from this, hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories. The new millennium arrived, the year 2000. Rebecca's case was now 22 years old. Most of the original investigators had retired. Detective Morrison was long gone from active duty. The community had changed. New families had moved into Harlan County. Younger generations had no memory of the summer of 1978. No memory of Rebecca Sullivan or the fear that had gripped the area, and the case was slipping into obscurity. And then, in 2003, Robert Sullivan died. Heart attack. Quick, the doctors said. He didn't suffer. But Patricia knew better. Robert had been suffering for 25 years, every day without answers. Every birthday, every Christmas, every August 3rd that came and went with Rebecca, still gone and her killer still free. Patricia was a widow now, still without closure, still waiting. Michael became the family's spokesman with investigators, the one who'd call the sheriff's office every few months asking if there was any progress, any new leads. The answer was always the same. We haven't forgotten about Rebecca. If anything changes, you'll be the first to know, but 2005 brought something new. Advances in DNA amplification techniques meant that even degraded samples could potentially yield results. Samples that were too small or too old to test in the 1990s could now be analyzed. It was progress. Slow progress, but progress. Then, in 2007, the Harlan County Sheriff's Department made a decision. They formed a dedicated cold case unit, a small team of investigators whose sole job was to go back through old cases and see what could be done with today's technology. That's when Detective Sarah Chen entered the story. She was 36, relatively new to the department but passionate about cold cases. She'd grown up hearing about Rebecca Sullivan. The case had been part of Harlan County's collective memory, never quite forgotten. Chen started reviewing old files. Cases from the 70s and 80s. Unsolved homicides that had been sitting in storage for decades. And when she got to Rebecca Sullivan's case, something about it caught her attention. The thoroughness of the original investigation. The quality of the evidence preservation, the family that had never given up, and the biological samples that, after nearly 30 years, were still viable. In late 2007, Detective Sarah Chen sat at her desk with Rebecca's file spread in front of her. The photos were faded, the reports typed on an actual typewriter, but the evidence, the biological samples preserved for nearly 30 years, that was still viable. And Chen had an idea. Let's talk about DNA for a minute. Not in a boring textbook way, but in a way that makes you realize just how revolutionary this technology is. Because what happened in Rebecca's case wasn't magic. It was science. Science that didn't exist when she was killed. Science that had to be invented, refined, and perfected over decades before it could finally give her family the answers they'd been waiting for. In 1978, if you wanted to identify someone from biological evidence, your options were limited. Blood typing could tell you if someone was type A, B, AB, or O, but that only narrowed the suspect pool. It didn't pinpoint anyone. Hair analysis could say whether a hair was similar to a suspect's, but it couldn't definitively match it. Fingerprints were reliable, but only if the suspect had left prints and was already in the system. DNA analysis didn't exist yet, not in any practical usable form. The first criminal case to use DNA evidence was in 1986 in England, 8 years after Rebecca's murder. A man named Colin Pitchfork was convicted of 2 murders using this new technique called DNA fingerprinting. And even then, it was experimental, expensive, time-consuming. It would be years before it became standard practice in the United States, and even longer before databases like CODIS made it possible to compare DNA across jurisdictions. But by 2008, DNA technology had evolved into something almost unrecognizable from its early days. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, had been established in 1998 as a national database. It allowed law enforcement to upload DNA profiles from crime scenes and compare them to profiles from convicted offenders. If the suspect's DNA was in that database, you got a match. Case closed. But what if the suspect had never been arrested? What if their DNA was never collected? What if they'd lived a quiet, law-abiding life for 31 years, and there was no reason their DNA would be in any criminal database? That's where genetic genealogy comes in. This was the game changer. Instead of relying on law enforcement databases, investigators could use public genealogy databases, the kind people voluntarily upload their DNA to when they're trying to trace their ancestry or find long-lost relatives. Sites like GIDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and others. When you upload your DNA to one of these sites, you're not just learning about yourself. You're also creating a genetic breadcrumb trail that connects you to everyone else in your family tree. Parents, grandparents, cousins, second cousins, third cousins you've never met. And if one of your relatives commits a crime and leaves DNA at the scene, that breadcrumb trail can lead investigators right to them. It's not a direct match, it's a map. Investigators take the DNA from the crime scene, upload it to a genealogy database, and look for people who share segments of that DNA. Those people are relatives, maybe distant, maybe close, but related. From there, a genetic genealogist builds a family tree. They trace those relatives back to common ancestors, then work forward through the generations to identify living descendants who fit the profile. The right age, the right location, the right time frame. It's detective work meets genealogy meets cutting-edge science. In 2018, this technique made international headlines when it was used to catch the Golden State Killer. Joseph James DeAngelo, a serial rapist and murderer who'd terrorized California in the 1970s and 80s. His DNA had been collected from crime scenes decades earlier, but it had never matched anyone in CODIS. So investigators tried something new. They uploaded his DNA to GEDmatch. They found distant relatives, built a family tree, narrowed down the suspects, and eventually identified DeAngelo. He was arrested in 2018, decades after his crimes, all because of genetic genealogy. The case sent shockwaves through law enforcement. If it worked for the Golden State Killer, it could work for other cold cases. Cases like Rebecca Sullivan's. In January 2008, Detective Sarah Chen made a decision. She was going to pursue genetic genealogy for Rebecca's case. The evidence was 30 years old. DNA degrades over time, especially if it's not stored properly. But the samples from Rebecca's case had been preserved well, kept in controlled conditions, sealed, protected. The lab extracted DNA from the biological evidence and ran it through the necessary tests. The quality was good. Good enough to generate a usable profile. That profile was uploaded to a genealogy database, and then the waiting began. Genetic genealogy isn't fast. It's not like you upload the DNA and get a name 5 minutes later. It takes time, weeks, sometimes months, because you're not looking for a direct match, you're looking for relatives, people who share 1%, 2%, maybe 5% of their DNA with the suspect. And from those tiny genetic connections, you have to reconstruct an entire family tree. Dr. Linda Martinez was the genetic genealogist assigned to Rebecca's case. She started with the matches that came back from the database, distant cousins, people who had no idea their DNA would one day help solve a murder. Martinez traced those connections back through generations: birth records, marriage certificates, census data, obituaries. She built branches of the family tree, following lines of descent, figuring out who was related to whom and how. It was slow, meticulous work. One wrong turn, one misidentified ancestor, and the whole tree could lead in the wrong direction. But she kept going. Weeks turned into months. The tree grew larger, more complex, and slowly a pattern started to emerge. There was a branch of the family, descendants of a couple who'd lived in Kentucky in the early 1900s, that kept showing up. Multiple matches pointed back to this same lineage. Martinez worked forward from there. Who were the living descendants of this couple? Where were they in 1978? Did any of them have ties to Harlan County? And then, in May 2009, a name surfaced. Someone who fit the profile. Someone who'd been in Kentucky in the summer of 1978. Someone whose age, location, and background made them a viable suspect. Martinez passed the name to Detective Chen. Now came the hard part: confirmation. Because genetic genealogy can point you in the right direction, but it's not enough to secure a conviction. You need direct evidence. You need the suspect's actual DNA compared against the crime scene DNA to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they're the same person. Detective Chen started digging into the name. Background checks, location history, 1978 whereabouts. Small connections appeared. The suspect had ties to the area. They'd been in Kentucky during Rebecca's murder. No alibi on record. Now, they just needed one thing: the suspect's DNA. In some cases, investigators will follow a suspect and collect discarded DNA, a coffee cup, a cigarette butt, a napkin. It's legal, and it's often the easiest way to get a sample without tipping off the suspect. In other cases, they'll approach the suspect directly and ask for a voluntary sample. Sometimes people comply, sometimes they don't. In Rebecca's case, investigators were able to obtain a sample. The exact method isn't public, legal reasons, ongoing proceedings, but they got what they needed. The sample was sent to the lab. The comparison test was run. Crime scene DNA versus suspect DNA. The analysis takes time, days, sometimes weeks. The lab techs work carefully, methodically, because there's no room for error. This isn't just numbers on a screen. This is 31 years of waiting. This is a family that's carried grief like a weight on their back since 1978. This is justice that's been delayed for 3 decades. And then the results came back. It's a match. After 31 years, they had him. Detective Sarah Chen received the confirmation on a Tuesday morning in early July 2009. She sat at her desk, staring at the report, reading the same lines over and over. DNA profile from crime scene matches DNA profile from suspect. Probability of random match, 1 in several trillion. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't quite process it. She'd believed it would work, had hoped it would work, but hoping and knowing are 2 different things. Then the moment passed, and she got to work. July 14th, 2009, 31 years and 1 month after Rebecca Sullivan was murdered. Patricia Sullivan was at home on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the phone rang. She almost didn't answer. Telemarketers probably, or someone trying to sell her something she didn't need, but something made her pick up. Mrs. Sullivan? Yes? This is Detective Sarah Chen with the Harlan County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about your daughter Rebecca's case. Patricia's heart stopped. In 31 years, calls from the Sheriff's Department had never brought good news. Just updates that weren't really updates, just reminders that the case was still open, still unsolved, still gathering dust. "Mrs. Sullivan, we've made an arrest." 4 words. That's all it took to change everything. Patricia couldn't speak, couldn't form words. She just stood there in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Sullivan, are you there?" Yes, I'm here." Chen's voice was steady, professional, but there was emotion underneath it. "I wanted you to hear it from me before it hits the news. We used genetic genealogy to identify a suspect. We obtained their DNA. It's a match. We made the arrest this morning." Patricia sank into a chair. Who was it?" "I can't release the name yet, but I promise you'll know everything as soon as we're legally able to share it." The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes. Chen gave Patricia the basics. What would happen next? How the legal process would unfold. That it would take time, but they had a strong case. When Patricia hung up, she immediately called Michael. "They arrested someone," she said, her voice shaking. "For Rebecca, they finally arrested someone." Michael called Jennifer. Jennifer called her husband. By that evening, the whole family had gathered at Patricia's house. The same house Rebecca had left from on June 14th, 1978, heading to her shift at Rosie's diner. The emotions were complicated. Relief, yes. After 31 years of waiting, of wondering, of living in limbo, but also anger. Because the person who killed Rebecca had walked free for 3 decades, had lived a normal life while their family lived in agony, had celebrated birthdays and holidays and milestones while Rebecca was buried in the ground at 22 years old. And grief, all over again, fresh and raw. Because this didn't bring Rebecca back. It didn't undo what happened. It didn't give Patricia back the daughter she'd lost, or give Michael and Jennifer back their sister. But it was something. After 31 years, it was finally something. The arrest itself wasn't dramatic. No Hollywood-style raid with SWAT teams and helicopters. It was quiet, methodical, controlled. Investigators knew where the suspect lived. They knew their routines. They'd been watching, planning, making sure everything was airtight. On the morning of July 14th, 2009, they made their move. The suspect's name hasn't been widely publicized. Privacy laws, ongoing legal proceedings, the nature of cold case arrests mean that sometimes details trickle out slowly. But here's what we know. The person arrested was someone who'd been living a relatively normal life. They had a job, a home, possibly a family. To the people around them, they were just a person. Unremarkable, forgettable, even. But in the summer of 1978, they'd done something unforgivable. And now, 31 years later, science had caught up with them. They were taken into custody without incident, charged with first-degree murder. The evidence against them was strong enough that prosecutors felt confident moving forward. If this story resonated with you, share it. Send it to someone who loves true crime, or drop a comment below. News of the arrest spread quickly through Harlan County. People who remembered 1978, who'd been there when Rebecca's body was found, when fear hung over the community like a fog, felt a strange mix of relief and anger. Relief that someone was finally being held accountable. Anger that it had taken 31 years. That the suspect had gotten to live freely while Rebecca's family lived in agony. For younger residents, people who hadn't been born yet in 1978, the arrest was a reminder that the past doesn't stay buried. That justice, even when it's delayed, can still arrive. Local news picked up the story immediately. 31 years later, DNA solves Kentucky cold case. National true crime outlets followed, podcasts, blogs, YouTube channels. Rebecca's case became, briefly, a headline again. The prosecution began building their case. The DNA evidence was the backbone, the thing that tied the suspect to the crime scene in a way that was nearly impossible to refute. But DNA alone doesn't tell the whole story. They'd also need to establish motive, opportunity, and means. Some of that information would come from the original 1978 investigation. Witness statements, timelines, evidence that had been sitting in storage for decades, waiting for this exact moment. Other details would come from the suspect's background, where they were in 1978, what they were doing, whether there were other incidents, other victims, other crimes that painted a picture of someone capable of violence. As of now, the case is working through the legal system. There may be a trial, there may be a plea deal, and we don't know yet how it will end. But we know this. After 31 years, Rebecca Sullivan's case is no longer cold. Justice is a strange thing. We talk about it like it's clean, final, like there's a moment where everything clicks into place and the scales balance out. But it's not like that. Not really. For the Sullivan family, the arrest in 2009 brought answers, but it didn't bring closure. Because how do you close a wound that's been open for 31 years? How do you move past something that's been woven into the fabric of your entire adult life? You don't. You just learn to live with it differently. In the weeks and months following the arrest, the family did interviews, local news, national outlets, true crime podcasts. Everyone wanted to know what it felt like to finally have answers after 3 decades. And they tried to put it into words. But words are inadequate for something like this. Relief, yes, but also exhaustion. Because fighting for justice for 31 years takes a toll. It's not just the emotional weight, it's the constant vigilance. The phone calls to the sheriff's office. The refusal to let Rebecca's case be forgotten. The fear, always lurking, that maybe it would be forgotten. Patricia gave an interview a few months after the arrest. She was 79 now, her hands shaking slightly as she held a photo of Rebecca from the summer of 1978. The reporter asked the question everyone asks: how does it feel to finally have justice? Patricia paused, looked down at the photo, and said something that stuck with everyone who heard it. It doesn't feel like justice. It feels like acknowledgement. Like the world is finally admitting that what happened to my daughter mattered. That she mattered. She wiped her eyes. But it doesn't bring her back, and that's the part that never gets easier. The arrest also had widespread effects beyond just Rebecca's case. Because when a cold case gets solved after 31 years, it sends a message to other families waiting for answers. Don't give up. Across Kentucky and across the country, there are thousands of unsolved homicides. Cases from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. Cases where the evidence exists, but the technology didn't. Cases where families have been waiting just as long as the Sullivans did, and every time a case like Rebecca's gets solved, it gives those families hope. It also puts pressure on law enforcement agencies to revisit their cold cases, to pull those files out of storage, to see if the evidence is still viable, to explore whether genetic genealogy or other modern forensic techniques might finally crack a case that's been sitting unsolved for decades. Some departments have dedicated cold case units now, teams of investigators whose sole job is to go back through old cases and see what can be done with today's technology. It's not a perfect system. Resources are limited. Some cases have better evidence than others, and not every case will have a resolution. But the fact that it's happening, that's progress. The Harlan County Sheriff's Office released a statement after the arrest, thanking the investigators who'd worked the case over the years, both the original team from 1978 and the modern team that brought it home in 2009. They also acknowledged Rebecca's family. This wouldn't have happened without you, the statement read, because cold cases don't solve themselves. They require pressure, advocacy, families who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten. The Sullivan family did that for 31 years. They kept Rebecca's name alive. They kept calling, kept asking, kept pushing. And in the end, that made all the difference. There's a broader conversation happening now, too, one about the ethics of using public genealogy databases to solve crimes. Because while most people agree that catching murderers is a good thing, there are legitimate concerns about privacy and government overreach. When you upload your DNA to a genealogy site, you're not just sharing information about yourself, you're sharing information about your entire family. Some people are fine with that. They see it as a civic duty, others are uncomfortable with it. It's a complicated issue, and there's no easy answer. But here's what's not complicated. Rebecca Sullivan deserved justice, and genetic genealogy made that possible. So where does that leave us? Rebecca Sullivan was 22 years old when she died. She had dreams, plans, a future that should have stretched out for decades. Instead, her life was cut short in June 1978 by someone who thought they'd never be caught. For 31 years, that person was right. But then science caught up. Investigators refused to quit, and a family's relentless hope finally paid off. Rebecca's case is a reminder that time doesn't erase the truth, it just delays it. It's a reminder that even when years turn into decades, there's always a chance, a possibility, a sliver of hope that one day the pieces will fall into place. And it's a reminder that victims are more than their deaths. Rebecca was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a life that mattered, even if it was taken too soon. If you're watching this and you have a loved one whose case is still unsolved, don't give up. Keep calling, keep pushing, keep their name alive. Because you never know when the breakthrough will come. It might be tomorrow. It might be 10 years from now. It might be 31 years from now. But it can happen. Rebecca's case proves that. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Sometimes it's justice waiting for science to catch up. And when it finally does, it's worth the wait. Thank you for joining us in uncovering stories hidden in the shadows. Every victim deserves to be remembered. Every truth deserves to be told. To follow more cold cases, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share these stories. Your support helps keep their voices alive.